You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Christopher Cox, a man I used to cheer on back in the Reagan days when he would go on Crossfire and beat up on the liberals and his friends who disagreed with him and his friends who agreed with him. He represents a different era in politics. Representative Cox is senior scholar in residence at the University of California, Irvine. He's a life trustee of the University of Southern California, chair of the Rhodes Scholarship Selection Committee for Southern California and the Pacific. He served in the United States House of Representatives. He's also a practicing lawyer, or was, which is heartening since my son is currently in law school. He has written for Fortune, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and dozens of other publications. But today, Congressman Cox is coming on to discuss his book, Woodrow Wilson, The Light Withdrawn. Congressman Cox, thank you very much for coming on the Leaders and Legends podcast.
It's a pleasure to join you.
We pay attention to subtitles here on our history podcast. Why is your book, your biography of Woodrow Wilson, why is the subtitle The Light Withdrawn?
Oh, it comes from a poem. The name of the poem is Ichabod. It was written in the middle of the 19th century by John Greenleaf Whittier, a poet and abolitionist who long admired Daniel Webster's leadership in the fight against slavery in the United States Senate. And by the way, Whittier, California, where Richard Nixon was born, is named after John Greenleaf Whittier. Shortly before Webster died, he broke faith with the abolitionists, and that broke millions of American hearts in the process. What Webster did specifically to antagonize the abolitionists and Whittier was support the fugitive slave law that was at the center of the Compromise of 1850. In response to that, Whittier published a mournful elegy for his former hero, who he said once wore glory as a crown and might have illuminated future ages. And those words, and the light withdrawn, in that same stanza, seemed to me especially appropriate for Woodrow Wilson as we're coming to better understand him. Whittier's counsel in this poem is to repress anger and rage when a leader that we have idealized shatters our hopes. And instead, those kinds of profound disappointments should be met with sadness, tempered by humility. And I think to those of us looking on from more than a century's distance at Woodrow Wilson, that's especially sage advice.
Wilson, as much as any president in the last, let's say, generation of evaluation, and we're going to get to his career and his beliefs and his remarkable set of accomplishments by any definition, remarkable set of accomplishments. But it seems that all great men and women at some point get reevaluated. It's fair to say Wilson is in the middle of his reevaluation. It's why you're very thorough biography couldn't be more timely. When I was in graduate school studying medieval history, we were constantly being admonished not to be teleological. That what 2024 means isn't what 1024 means. How do you, as a historian, as a writer, as a public servant, how do you treat Wilson fairly based on our norms today compared to his norms or society's norms back in the late 19th, early 20th century?
Yeah, I think you're right that we have to avoid presentism. That is, judging people and events earlier in history by the norms and the experiences of our own time. That's really what I'm getting at by invoking Whittier's counsel. We need to have some humility when we assess this individual as an entirety, his entire career. And so in the book, I wanted to look at his upbringing, where he came from, why he thought the way that he did about things. But I think also when we assess Wilson, we need to shed any romanticism. He deserves unbiased scrutiny and some searching scrutiny. He was criticized by people of his own day. He was criticized roundly by Northern progressives of his time for his racial prejudice. And in assessing Wilson and putting aside our present day attitudes and biases, it's completely fair to judge him by the standards of the second half of the 19th century and the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And I think measured against the views of other progressive Democrats and of the Republicans of the day, who were very much animated by civil rights, that had been their legacy since the Civil War, Wilson fell far short when it came to race. He, of course, left us with a significant body of written work that explains his views, and we can rely on that. And it's straight from the horse's mouth when we read his books like Division and Reunion that he published when he was 36. Then he took pains to rationalize his family's role in the perpetuation of slavery. He, in fact, let all of Southern society off the hook. He described their responsibility for slavery as remote, and he put it in religious terms, something he inherited from his father. He pronounced their participation in slavery not a willful sin. And at age 46, while he was president of Princeton University, he wrote still about slavery that it was not so dark a thing as it was painted. He claimed that the masters' human property were happy and well cared for. Mm-hmm. And even when he acknowledged that they were forced to work at the great plantations where the air was malarial, he contended that millions of men and women in bondage were, quote, little worse off for it. So I think we have plenty of evidence to evaluate Woodrow Wilson by the standards of his time and by his own expressions, his own words in writing. In the cases I just mentioned, his publications, but also his private thinking in his own diaries or in his letters to his fiancée and his wife, or to his friends, his classmates, and so on, where he let his hair hang down a bit.
Is that an advantage in writing about someone who, among his many other titles, is also an academic? In other words, it's hard to be an academic without doing a considerable amount of writing. So how did that help you write this biography to get into Wilson's mind, to try to understand him? Is that something where you're like, wow, we don't have to guess. He tells us what he thinks about X.
Yes, absolutely. And not just because he was an academic, but also because in addition to the books that he wrote, in addition to the lectures that he gave and the articles that he published, we also have volumes and volumes and volumes that have been put together by scholars who succeeded him, comprising his massive correspondence with other people. It's all been assembled and carefully kept. For Wilson biographers, it is just a treasure trove. And that's what makes it so exciting for Wilson, for readers of these biographies, because you really are getting a lot of firsthand evidence, not secondary opinions or some sort of exegesis of what he might have thought. We know what he thought.
How did Woodrow Wilson catch your eye as a historian? And what do you think about him or know about him now that you didn't know when you first put pen to paper?
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things. One is that I got into Woodrow Wilson for purposes of writing this book through the side door. I was exploring women's suffrage, and I have long been interested in women's suffrage. To be honest, if I go back and think about when and why I chose women's suffrage as something that I was interested in, it takes me back to my law school days. The very first thing I wrote for the Harvard Law Review was a piece about the 1971 Supreme Court decision that for the first time declared that the 14th Amendment applied to sex discrimination. And about that time, I had a conversation with my grandmother in which I rather naively asked her, "What was the first presidential election you voted in?" And she looked at me crosswise. She didn't say, "You dummy," but she said it with her face and her expression. 1920, that was the first year we could vote. And so I quickly realized the mistake that I'd made. But then I followed up and I said, "Who did you vote for?" And again, she looked at me a little bit crosswise and she said, "Harding, of course, because Republicans got us the vote." And I had never heard this before, but she explained that she lived in Minnesota at the time and that they had a Republican legislature and a Republican governor, and they'd actually gotten the vote some months before the ratification of the 19th Amendment. On exploration, I subsequently discovered that the story was much more complicated. There were, of course, Democrats, Republicans, both for and against women's suffrage. It was much more of a mixed bag, but a much more interesting story because of that. But the more I explored this business of how women got the vote, the more Woodrow Wilson became part of it. Woodrow Wilson was seemingly at the center of everything in the final denouement of this great drama that had taken place in American public policy and in American society ever since the Civil War. And really, in the years before the Civil War, the women's suffrage movement started in earnest in the 1840s. So I'd say that's how I got started on Wilson. But once you get started on Wilson, you realize that the 28th president was important for lots of reasons. He was important, incredibly important, for what he accomplished with his own power, but also for the period in which he lived and governed. His presidency is influential still today, both for what he himself did and for what was happening around him. If you want to understand World War II, for example, the Cold War that followed it, or today's ongoing wars in the Middle East, or even the running debate over America's chosen role as global superpower, the Wilson years really are the fountainhead. If you want to understand how Jim Crow erupted in the 20th century long after Reconstruction was a distant memory, then study the Wilson years. Today's debates over racial justice and gender, that seems to have divided Americans more deeply than ever, but whether it's a comfort or not, the Wilson years were far worse. It's important for all of us, I think, to understand just how horrible government policy on race and gender has been in the past if we want to appreciate how and why there's so much attention paid these days to systemic racism and sexism in our history that still influences America now. The same goes for our debates over free speech. The Wilson years are the outstanding example, I'd say, in the past century when it comes to the government denying free speech and civil liberties to the citizenry. And I think it's instructive to recall what the government did to women peacefully protesting for the right to vote silently in front of the White House, or to pacifists who opposed the war in their writings and their public speeches. They got thrown in jail. In this new biography of Wilson, I have focused on Wilson's attitudes on the proposed constitutional amendment to grant women the right to vote, because that was one of the most significant events of the 20th century. And in fact, I'd say it's one of the greatest advances in the entire history of American democracy. There was a Gallup poll at the beginning of the 21st century that asked the American public to name the most important event of the 20th century, and 66% chose women gaining the right to vote. That was ahead of landing a man on the moon or the fall of the Soviet Union or even World War I and the Great Depression. Only World War II ranked higher. And yet Wilson's biographers have never treated it that way. It's more than a lacuna in the Wilson story. It's a gaping hole. And it turns out the true story is damned interesting.
And you really begin your book going through that and some other things, but taking it through the suffrage fight. And it's one of those things where you read about it now and you go, why the hell was this even a debate? How was this not just, how could people not? I've read biographies of Queen Victoria, and she wasn't a fan of women getting the vote in Great Britain. So how does someone like you who served in office?
Of course, she already had a vote.
Yeah, she did. How does someone like you who's talked in front of female voters, had female staffers, had served with female colleagues in Congress, how do you wrap your mind around the fact that 100 years ago, women couldn't vote?
Yeah, and for somebody like me who was born in the Truman administration, it's one thing. I have a little bit of a distant memory of times before I was born from people that I actually knew and talked to and so on. But for people born in the 21st century who aren't all that young anymore, some things, it's almost impossible to conceive that this could have happened in any time subsequent to the caveman days. I think it's really important to reprise this story, to bring it in living color to an audience in the third decade of the 21st century. It's a super important part of our history. And one of the things that you discover when you explore this in detail is how close we came around Reconstruction time, some 20 years into the women's suffrage movement, to granting women the right to vote by constitutional amendment. The 14th Amendment, one of the Reconstruction amendments, the second one, when it first came out of committee, had women included in its protection for voting rights. And when the 15th Amendment came up, there was great agitation to make sure that the 15th Amendment, which was aimed at getting black men the right to vote, also included women. And there were many Republicans in Congress who were willing to support this. So it came very close. And yet it took so long that in the 20th century, when Woodrow Wilson shows up and women's suffrage is really at a tipping point, he's in a position to hold back the tide. And that's what he did until really it was impossible for him to do so any longer. He literally flipped his position on women's suffrage the night before 2/3 of the House of Representatives voted to approve the constitutional amendment.
You're listening to Leaders and Legends. Our guest today is former Congressman Christopher Cox. We are discussing his new book, Woodrow Wilson, The Light Withdrawn. You mentioned a few minutes ago about your memory. And every once in a while, I read things and I should have known that, but yet I didn't put it in context. Woodrow Wilson was born when Franklin Pierce was president. He remembered the start of the Civil War. He remembered the surrender at Appomattox. That's astonishing to me. I don't know why it is, but it's just because it's so few other generals or few other presidents understood that or remembered it that way, the way that he did. He was born in Virginia. Is that correct?
Correct. Stanton, Virginia.
That's right. And to say that he was influenced by the songs of the South, to put it that way, would be an understatement. Is there a way to exculpate him on his views regarding race using his upbringing as the foundation? In other words, he grew up a certain way, he was taught a certain way, and he just never grew out of it?
I think it's fair to say he never grew out of it. And I think you've asked the right question. It's one that's important to attempt, at least, to unravel. I'm not sure it's possible to do it in a completely objective way, but probably the way to start is to go over that background and examine what made Wilson's upbringing unique. And I think his Southern Democratic background was, in fact, the most profound and enduring influence on his life's work, both as an academic and as a politician. When people think of Woodrow Wilson, at least when I used to first imagine Woodrow Wilson, I remember my high school history book had, a cartoon of him as the schoolmaster. We naturally remember him as president of Princeton University and maybe briefly as governor of New Jersey, but in other words, as a man from the Northeast. But Wilson was, in fact, a Southerner through and through. As you say, he was born in Virginia. The family soon moved to Georgia, where he lived until he was a teenager. He and his family then moved to South Carolina, and 4 years after that to North Carolina. He started college in South Carolina at Davidson before finally moving north to the College of New Jersey, as Princeton was then called. But even then, when he was at the College of New Jersey, he returned to his family home in the South for the academic summers. And when he graduated from college, he made a brief but entirely unsuccessful attempt at law school, and that was also in the South at the University of Virginia. And after that, he moved back to Georgia, where he met his future Georgia wife. Eventually, he started graduate school at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, and even that was just south of the Mason-Dixon line. And as late as his late 20s, he was still moving back home with his parents in North Carolina whenever there was an academic break. It wasn't until he got his first paying job when he was 28 years old as a teacher at Bryn Mawr College outside of Philadelphia that he actually moved his domicile to the north. His upbringing for all of those years in the South, I'd say, influenced him most importantly in the way that you mentioned. His years in the South coincided precisely with the Civil War and the years of Reconstruction that followed that. His family were very much on the Confederate side. His father was a Presbyterian minister who preached to his segregated conversation that slavery was part of God's plan, and slavery benefited Black men and women and children. Slavery was something, he said, that everyone should cherish because it enriched the superior race. The Wilson family were waited on by enslaved Black servants. Wilson was the last American president to grow up with slavery literally in his own household through his 8th year. In the run-up to the Civil War, Wilson's father broke with the Presbyterian Church because it had condemned slavery as a sin, and he became a leader in the creation of a breakaway, Presbyterian church,
Right.
which they called the Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States of America. And this new church wholeheartedly embraced slavery. Then when the war came, Wilson's father became a military chaplain with the rank of officer in the Confederate Army. And he also volunteered in a Confederate home defense unit called the Silver Grays. He turned the church, his Presbyterian church, into a hospital for Confederate soldiers during the war, and at the same time built a stockade around the churchyard, which became a POW prison yard for Union soldiers. Years later, the adult Woodrow Wilson recalled his father commanding his congregants from the pulpit, "The forces of the Confederacy are suffering from a lack of ammunition, and the congregation must do its duty. Immediately, the women following these services will repair to the ammunition factory to help with the cartridges." Through all of this, and through all of his adult life, Wilson worshiped his father. He devoted an entire speech while he was president to saying so. The father's influence on the son was unmistakable from the start. There was a 1912 campaign biography in which Wilson, it was said, was known as a Democrat of stout opinions from the day he first opened his mouth on campus. And his partisanship sprang from his disgust with Reconstruction and Republicans' insistence on giving black men the vote after the war. At the College of New Jersey, where he attended more than a decade after the Civil War was over, he was arguing with his classmates passionately about the righteousness of the Southern cause, and he often got quite angry about it. A couple of years after he graduated, once again living in the South, he wrote an article that he submitted to the New York Evening Post that was his attempt to explain to the benighted Northerners what was wrong with the Republican Party. Fundamentally, he said, the Republicans were defying nature because the Saxon race, as he called it, were determined that the Negro race shall never again rule over them as they had during Reconstruction. But the Republicans, he complained in this article, refused to recognize this, and he castigated Republicans for promoting ignorant suffrage. One of the memorable lines in this piece was from a fire-breathing white supremacist of the day. Republicans, he said, have declared to the world that there's no difference between an American freeman and an American slave, which may not be unmade by a mere act of Congress. Wilson stuck to these views throughout his years as a professor. He lectured to his students at Johns Hopkins that slavery had done more for the Negro in 250 years than African freedom had done since the building of the pyramids. On the Princeton faculty, he wrote about Reconstruction in his History of the American People. Same thing, once again. He condemned Republicans for giving black men the vote because it, quote, placed an intolerable burden on the white men of the South. Wilson lived through the worst years of Ku Klux Klan violence when he was a young man in South Carolina. And in his History of the American People, which was his last publication before becoming president of Princeton, he described the men of the Ku Klux Klan as, quote, the real leaders of Southern communities. He acknowledged that they took the law into their own hands, but he said they had no choice because they merely undertook by intimidation what they were not allowed to attempt by the ballot. And of course, all of this culminates in Wilson's actions when he's elected president of the United States. For starters, he overloads his cabinet with Southern Democrats who were uncompromising white supremacists, and one of his first initiatives in the White House is to segregate the federal government. 3 years ago, in 2021, the National Bureau of Economic Research did a study of the civil service records during the Wilson administration. What they found was that there was segregation not just of the Treasury or the Postal Service, which we've read about, but of the entire civil service under Woodrow Wilson. And Wilson was very public while he was president in defending his segregation policies. In a nutshell, I'd say that Wilson's intense feelings about black men voting in Reconstruction, which were born of his first 3 decades in the South, were the most important reason for his partisan identification as a Democrat, both during his years in academia and in politics. And I find it hard to say that's okay because that's the way he grew up, when at Princeton for all of those years and in Washington, when he certainly had plenty of contact with progressive Democrats who didn't think that way, he stuck to those ideas.
It's also interesting to read Wilson's views and actions in the context of the social Darwinism that was sweeping the world, especially Europe and other places, the philosophy of white man's burden, and we must lord over the people of color, and we are chosen, and we're Christian, and all that sort of thing that was so very popular. The clashing of the races that's sure to come, the Teutonic versus the Slav. Did Wilson buy in? It sounds like he did, but just specifically for a second, did he buy into that sense of social Darwinism, the strong over the weak, survival of the fittest, and hey, England, the white races rule the world, and that's because God wants the white races to rule the world because we're just better?
There was certainly a religious aspect to the way that Woodrow Wilson looked at most things when it came to politics and public policy. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, he had a religious interpretation that he expressed in writing of who was at fault or not for slavery. Yeah, I would say second, that Wilson wasn't just going along with this. He was an advocate of this in his writings. The second book that he wrote was called The State, and it was meant to be a college textbook. It's a general overview of the world's governments. But what really distinguishes this book, and it's the way the book starts out, is that he forms a hierarchy of the world's governments strictly according to race. And at the top are the people that he calls the Aryans. Below that come the Semitic peoples. And he said they must have a secondary place. And below that, he placed people such as the Turks and people that he called the Hottentots, who he said were savages and not worthy of study at all. And he did not include the Chinese or the Russians or what have you, because they were not the most advanced in the evolutionary scheme. That's how he put it.
What was and what is, because I've read two separate articles on this as part of preparing for the podcast. What is and what was Woodrow Wilson's reputation as a scholar?
I think it was a strong reputation while he was actually active as a professor at Princeton. He was very popular on campus. Wilson always focused on his presentation. His father was, of course, a minister and spoke from the pulpit, and declamation was always something that Wilson studied and practiced at. He would go into an empty pulpit and give speeches to an empty church as a way to practice. And he joined the debate teams when he was in college. Some of his students, particularly his female students when he was teaching at Bryn Mawr, felt that they were nothing but props in the audience. They were good for nothing else. He wasn't interested in what they had to say. They were just there to be spoken at. But his lectures, by all accounts, were in fact polished. And he was very interested and concerned with how he came across. And he paid a lot of attention to the words that he chose. When Princeton was celebrating its founding and changed its name from the College of New Jersey to Princeton University, he was still on the faculty, and they chose him as one of the speakers for that important day because he was so good at it. And he was they didn't have actual rankings of teachers at that time, but he was highly favored by his students, one of the most popular professors on campus. His books, to get very pointedly to the scholarship question you raise, were really never aimed at an academic audience. And so historians subsequently have found them to be, if not mistaken in some of what they have to say, although they've found those kinds of flaws with it as well, but they found it to be not much in the way of scholarship. But Wilson knew what he was doing, and he was publishing, for the most part, for popular audiences, and that's what spread his name across the country. His biography of George Washington, excuse me, was illustrated, and it was repetitive of the hagiographies that had been published for quite a long time about the first president. But it made a lot of money, made money for the publisher, made money for him, for the American people. It too was illustrated, and it too was aimed at a popular audience and had a mass market and made him, again, a lot of money. Yes and no on this point. He was very successful as a writer, but he wasn't much of an academic writer. And there's a Harvard scholar named Henry Bragdon who assessed his writings much closer to our own time and found them severely wanting. One of his brutal assessments was that very little of it is even readable.
Yeah, I'd say that's brutal. Woodrow Wilson was born in 1856. From 1902 to 1910, he was president of Princeton University, as you just mentioned. Is it during this time or before this time at Princeton? Because Lord knows academia has its own share of politics and political maneuvering. When did Woodrow Wilson get bitten by the political bug enough to where he wants to run for office?
He actually decided very early in his life that he wanted to be a senator. This was while he was still in school. And a lot of the reading that he did, recreational reading, was political biographies. He wanted to be, in particular, a senator from Virginia. That was his very first ambition. But the timing of his actually jumping into politics was actually situational. He had been fighting with his board at Princeton for several years, and by 1910, he'd lost the confidence of a majority of the board. The issues that they were fighting about were not all that unusual. They were the sort of academic policy matters that normally occupy university managements. What was atypical was Wilson's decision to fall on his sword over what should have been manageable issues. The future of the school's eating clubs, the precise location of Princeton's proposed new graduate school buildings. It was his native stubbornness that got him into trouble. But just as he was being forced out by his board, he found a way to capitalize on the controversy by taking it public. He began to make high-profile speeches criticizing not only Princeton's board, but its donors. And the same Woodrow Wilson, who had worked very aggressively to make Princeton a lily-white male bastion, but he wanted to make sure blacks would never enter Princeton, could now be heard lecturing a group of Princeton alumni on the evils of class privilege. He decried the trustees with cruel hands who would leave the common people outside Princeton's walls, as if that were somehow the consequence of putting graduate and undergraduate buildings in different locations. Wilson himself was nothing if not an elitist, but he knew precisely what he was doing. By talking over the heads of the Princeton trustees to a general audience and using shocking language that was guaranteed to earn him headlines, he was advancing his plan to run for governor. And every speaking opportunity that he received as president of Princeton, he turned into an opportunity to campaign for that objective. And his strategy worked. He finally found a way to realize his boyhood dream. His boisterous argument attracted a lot of public attention, and among the audience were New Jersey's powerful Democratic bosses. They were paying rapt attention, and at the time they were desperate to recover from a string of losses at the hands of the Republicans. They needed something new, something different, the kind of candidate who could ride this national wave of reform that was coming to be called progressivism. And Wilson's lack of any record in politics meant that he could perfectly tailor himself to the issues of the day. And better still, the fact that he'd been cloistered in academia for 2 decades guaranteed that, unlike just about everybody else in politics, he was free of any taint of political corruption. So that's exactly what the current electoral mood demanded. His timing was perfect. He was getting kicked out of Princeton at just the moment that was perfect for him. It paved the way for his instant transition, literally a matter of months, from campus to the State House in Trenton.
You're listening to Leaders and Legends. We are discussing the book Woodrow Wilson, The Light Withdrawn, with its author, former Congressman Christopher Cox. How would you today, because it perhaps is different, would you describe Wilson as a progressive? And how did progressivism in the early 20th century, how does that compare to what we conceive of it now?
Progressivism at Wilson's time was still in the cauldron. It was in formation. Teddy Roosevelt, of course, preceded him as president, and Teddy Roosevelt was a progressive, trust-busting, controlling the excesses of corporations, bringing power to the people through initiative and referendum and so on. These were the bulwark of progressivism of the day. But for Southern Democrats, there was one more element, and that was white supremacism. So we had an infection, if that's a way to look at it through present day standards, I'm acknowledging. But I will say progressivism was infected by this Southern flavor of white supremacy. So the leading Southern Democrats who were progressives were also racists and white supremacists. And these were the people who supported Woodrow Wilson going into the Democratic Convention in 1912. It is unfair to other progressives of the time to smear them with this label. But there's one important distinction between them and Woodrow Wilson. He became president for 2 terms, and he very much, therefore, defined what progressivism was all about. He stacked his cabinet with these Southern Democratic progressive white supremacists. And so that is how we think of progressivism then, for that reason. By the way, I should add, it wasn't just Southern Democrats who were in the progressive movement and who were racists. William Jennings Bryan is Exhibit A of someone who was a Ku Klux Klan supporter who was from Nebraska. He was not a Southerner, but he was defending the Ku Klux Klan even after the Wilson administration was gone. He did so at the Democratic Convention, where he spoke for a half hour in opposition to a resolution condemning the Klan. When he died, when William Jennings Bryan died, Klan organizations across America held cross burnings in his honor, and one of them in Ohio, they lit on fire in the dark their crosses that spelled out "to the greatest Klansman of our time." We don't have evidence that William Jennings Bryan ever actually was a member of the Klan, but he supported Klansmen for elective office. They supported him, and he published in the New York Times an article about how important white supremacism was. So no question about him. It wasn't just Southerners. There were people of this sort in the North as well. Today, I think all, I will say, right-thinking people, although we don't usually use that term to describe progressives as people of the right, but right in terms of moral, it's pretty easy today in the 21st century to say we think that sort of outrageous racism and white supremacism is just wrong and doesn't have a home in any legitimate political party in the United States, but certainly not in progressivism. And progressives today all renounce things like that and have for quite some time. So that's a giant difference between progressivism then and now. And of course, on other parameters, such as the role of government, government's just so much bigger now that continuing to expand it is a little bit of a different challenge than expanding on the relatively tiny federal government that existed back in Wilson's time.
The election of 1912 is unlike, and let me say that again, the presidential election of 1912 is unlike any other election in American history. It really is sui generis. It's Woodrow Wilson, Theodore Roosevelt, who had served as president, and the current serving president, William Howard Taft, running for a second term. How do you, as a historian, we all know the outcome. Wilson wins. He wins handily, 435 electoral votes. Roosevelt, 88, and President Taft, only 8. How do you, as a historian, and maybe even as a I hate to call you a politician, so that's not meant to be an insult, but as someone who's run for office, how do you make sense of the election of 1912?
It was another great opportunity and great fortune in timing for Woodrow Wilson, because, as I mentioned, he was very new on the scene. Republicans had been in charge, and here was an opportunity for Democrats on a silver platter, because not one but 2 Republican presidents were going to be on the ballot against him. Roosevelt, as between the 2 Republicans, Roosevelt now, of course, running as a third-party candidate after he walked out of the Republican convention. Roosevelt was the stronger of the 2 in terms of the popular vote, but Roosevelt and Taft combined that year got a majority of the popular vote, and so in walks Woodrow Wilson as the victor with 42%. Roosevelt and Wilson actually had a relationship. They knew each other. And in this respect, for something of an odd reason, which I can explain, Wilson also benefited, because at first, Wilson and Roosevelt were friends. It was only later that they became enemies. They met briefly in 1896 when Roosevelt was police commissioner in New York. and Wilson was then a Princeton professor. After that brief meeting, Wilson attended a small dinner on the Princeton campus where Roosevelt was the honored guest, and he followed up on the connection that he made, or the reconnection that he made that evening, through a friendly correspondence. During that friendly correspondence, Roosevelt published a positive review of Wilson's book, Division and Reunion. And at Wilson's request, he did him a favor. He attempted to find Wilson's friend Edward Rennick a job at the Navy Department. This is while he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Wilson and Roosevelt kept up their occasional letter writing all the way through Roosevelt's election to the New York governorship in 1898, and then his election 2 years later as McKinley's vice president. At that time, Wilson wrote to his wife Ellen in early 1900 that he had discovered in Roosevelt a very sane academic side that he said was not known by most people even to exist. And he told Ellen that he saw Roosevelt as a man of real and lasting eminence. But then when Teddy Roosevelt became an accidental president after McKinley's assassination, Wilson publicly criticized him for inviting the well-known black educator Booker T. Washington to the White House. So he's now starting to distance himself because Roosevelt is a Republican president, and that to him as a lifelong Democrat, and a lifelong Democrat in large part because of issues of race, that labeled Roosevelt as the enemy, or at least the opponent. Wilson said he objected to Roosevelt's attempt to initiate the black people into the social circles of the whites. And so when they faced off in the 1912 election, Roosevelt declined to make an issue of Wilson's widely rumored affair with a married woman, and I think that was in part because of their prior association. There were reports at the time that Wilson was implicated in this woman's divorce that year, and specifically that the judge in her divorce case had seen one of Wilson's revealing letters to her. Wilson wrote privately that this could ruin me utterly and put an end to my candidacy and my career. But when letters between Wilson and this woman whose name was Mary Peck, that were described as salacious and incriminating, were dangled before the Roosevelt campaign, TR personally decided not to exploit the controversy. And instead, he joked that even if Wilson had cheated on his wife, the voters would never believe it because Wilson looked so much like an apothecary's clerk. So it was also Wilson's good fortune that Roosevelt had chosen to run as a third-party candidate, and that effectively, of course, had put two Republican presidents on the ballot against him. From a distance, I think you could also say that Wilson took lessons from Roosevelt, who, after all, was a progressive long before Wilson was. At the time of Roosevelt's presidency, Wilson was still a Bourbon Democrat. He was criticizing labor unions for encouraging workers to do as little as possible. And he was opposed to progressive ideas like the initiative and referendum. His conversion to progressivism came on very suddenly in his 1910 gubernatorial campaign. And even then, his speeches borrowed heavily from Roosevelt's outspoken style. So when he's condemning monopoly and privilege and corporate abuses, we can hear echoes of TR.
I'll make a claim, and you agree or shoot me down. Woodrow Wilson's first term is more successful and impactful than Woodrow Wilson's second term.
Very difficult to disagree with that because notwithstanding World War I, which is impossible to overlook, that's the decision to lead America into World War I was primarily Wilson's. And to his everlasting credit or not, depending on how one looks at that, that's major. It's hard to diminish that. But overall, when one takes the war to include the Paris Peace Conference and the Versailles Treaty, there was a lot of failure written into that. Whereas, particularly in the opening year and a half of his first administration, he was passing a lot of important legislation, and those are achievements and accomplishments that still stand. Yes, I would say that his first term was in fact more successful. And when you throw in the fact that starting in October 1919, he was darn near out of commission because of a serious stroke and all of the sequelae. Yeah, he was really only president for half a term, second time around.
You are an incredibly, and I say this not just because you're kind enough to come on the Leaders and Legends podcast to discuss your book. Mr. Cox, you're an incredibly intelligent man, and I'm going to ask you to do something for someone, meaning me, the host, and hopefully the listeners as well, since I got a C in microeconomics and a C plus in macroeconomics. Can you explain the Federal Reserve System as conceived by Wilson and why it was necessary, or if it was necessary? Because that seemed to have been one of the more revolutionary acts of any president that didn't involve war, per se.
Yes, and I will start with the history. And Wilson conceived of this as an early, perhaps the earliest initiative of his administration. Not specifically the creation of the Federal Reserve, but rather what started out as a currency issue. And in fact, he conjoined the tariff issue and the currency issue. The currency issue is a polite way of talking about what William Jennings Bryan had tilted at for some time with his monetary policy of free coinage of silver in order to relieve the pressure on borrowers that he saw was the result of the gold standard. So it was an inflationary policy. When Wilson gets to Congress, and I should say also concerning the tariff, that Wilson was steeped in anti-tariff tradition because he was a Southerner. The tariff was a big issue in presidential elections throughout the 19th century in the South, where they felt they got nothing from a policy of protection while the Northern manufacturers did. They ended up paying the higher prices, and they had nothing to gain and hated it.
The tariff of abomination, one of my favorite terms.
Goes all the way back to the tariff of abominations, absolutely. And when Wilson ran for governor, he actually seized on the opportunity to talk about the tariff. It's really the only substantive issue that he took on in that very brief race of a matter of weeks when he ran for governor. But he knew all about the tariff, didn't know that much about the currency issue, except that he knew that he wasn't going to go after the gold standard the way that William Jennings Bryan had. He was happy to beat on the tariff. So when he gets to Washington, the Congress has already got policies and bills in motion. And Carter Glass, who later on wound up as Secretary of the Treasury for Woodrow Wilson and others in Congress, were talking about how to come up with a system where the bankers weren't all of themselves in charge of the currency question. And the debate at first was about who should run. Remember, the National Bank, of course, was an issue much earlier in American history. There is a little bit of continuity here. This isn't totally out of the blue. It's not totally a creation even of William Jennings Bryan's speeches. And what was the initial argument was, should private bankers be in charge of this, or should the federal government be in charge of everything? Wilson's instinct was to put the federal government totally in charge because he didn't want to have the regulated be also involved with the regulator. What ultimately the Congress compromised on, and what Wilson agreed to, was a system, first of all, that took total control away from the bankers, but gave the bankers an opportunity to participate. So they have this governance system that not only is participatory in that way, but also is regional. So we have regional banks, and that's a classic congressional way to solve things. It's why we have a lot of defense infrastructure in Alabama. Uh,
I'm sorry, I don't mean to
nothing.
laugh over your comments, but I knew exactly where you were headed.
Yeah. And the creation of the Federal Reserve uh, perhaps didn't portend at first what the Federal Reserve would become in toto. It is now, of course, an enormity and has a balance sheet that would have astonished anybody of Wilson's time. But the structure of it originated in that way, and the creation of the institution of the Federal Reserve is one that absolutely has stayed with us and for which Woodrow Wilson and his administration and the Congress of the time deserve full credit.
President Wilson's greatest accomplishment?
I don't know. Maybe. It depends. Your ranking, I think, of what is a great accomplishment is influenced somewhat by how things turned out, which may or may not be fair to the appraisal. The Federal Reserve, as I said, is now an enormity. It is perhaps the biggest thing with which Woodrow Wilson is associated. One might say the League of Nations, which morphed into the United Nations. But again, that depends on what one thinks of the efficacy of the United Nations or the fact that Wilson's personal involvement with the League of Nations resulted in the United States failing to be part of it.
I guess if I'm ever lucky enough to get Senator Rand Paul on the podcast, I'll ask him if the Federal Reserve is Woodrow Wilson's greatest accomplishment. See what the answer he gives.
I'm reasonably certain he would say no, just because of what I'm saying is his answer will be totally influenced by what he thinks of the Federal Reserve.
1916, one of the most overlooked presidential elections in our history, a true turning point, considering what could have happened, what did happen. It's astonishingly close. Woodrow Wilson wins 277 electoral votes. Charles Evans Hughes, 254, the Republican. He loses. The race basically turns on 3,773 votes in California. Wilson's margin of victory, he wins California's 13 electoral votes, tips the election his way. Wilson's victory paves the way for so much controversy and accomplishments in a second term, but the rock, paper, and scissors of which is America's involvement in the Great War. Would you consider Wilson a reluctant warrior or a conniving ally or something else? I just chose those two terms because I'm very interested in World War I, the Great War, especially from the Russian side and how they get involved.
Mm-hmm.
Where would you put Wilson on the scale of, we really can't do this, I guess we have to, as opposed to, damn, we got to get in this war somehow?
This is the most complicated question to unravel in the Wilson story because Wilson's motivations were so often conflicting. Whereas in all of these other areas, we can go to what Wilson wrote and see what he thought and answer these questions. Here, even the written record shows him to be all over the place. He was coming into the presidency, excuse me, a complete rookie when it came to foreign policy and national defense. So he didn't have a record. He didn't have a pattern or habits or any predictable course of action. He, in fact, remarked to a confidant that it would be the irony of fate if my administration had to deal chiefly with foreign affairs. Almost immediately, he ran into foreign policy and national security challenges with the eruption of the Mexican Revolution that greeted him when he first came to office. And his response to it was chaotic and inconsistent. Under Roosevelt and Taft, the objective of U.S. foreign policy was to protect U.S. lives and property in Mexico. Wilson attempted at first to displace the president of Mexico because he had seized power rather than won a democratic election. But Mexico's experience with democracy was very spotty, and its presidents had variously seized power and subsequently won elections until someone else seized power and so on. So it was risky business for Wilson to intervene on the grounds of democracy. Wilson's invasion of Veracruz and the 6-month occupation of that portion of Mexico that followed in 1914 cost American lives and ultimately accomplished nothing. And after he played favorites in the revolutionary contest for leadership of the Mexican government by providing Carranza with arms and logistical support in battles, the contestant that he hadn't supported, Pancho Villa, attacked a U.S. Army post across the New Mexico border and killed 18 Americans. And Wilson then sent a raiding party deep into Mexico to capture Pancho Villa, and that expedition failed to achieve its objective. So all of this experience made him more cautious about intervening in other countries' wars. When World War I broke out in 1914, he pledged categorically to stay out of it. And even after the sinking of the Lusitania in May 1915 and the loss of 123 American lives, he famously declared that America was too proud to fight. In his re-election year, 1916, as you say, he ran against Charles Evans Hughes. Hughes was not running, as Wilson was, as the peace candidate, but neither was he running as someone who said we should get into war. His platform was, we need to be strong so that the Germans understand that if they make any move, they will be met with force. Whereas Hughes and Roosevelt, who was his main surrogate, accused Wilson's peace policy and neutrality policy of provoking the Germans to be more aggressive. Wilson's campaign ads, in turn, were so blunt that some of the printed advertisements said, if you want war, vote for Hughes. And of course, Wilson's campaign buttons said simply peace. He promised in his speeches that we would stay out until the end.
He kept us out of war.
And the Democratic platform reminded Americans that he kept us out of war. But during that 1916 campaign, we know from the documentary record, he privately told his advisors, and he even told a trusted reporter who kept it confidential, that America should be in the war now. This is before the election. He confided to his chief of staff, who was called the White House secretary at the time, Joe Tumulty, that war with Germany is inevitable. And although someday the people of America will know the full circumstances, I cannot tell them now. 3 weeks after his inauguration, he then asked Congress for a declaration of war against Germany. So looking back on that experience, Wilson's Secretary of War, Lindley Garrison, judged him very harshly for his willingness to decide issues of war and peace on the basis of politics. He described Wilson as a man of high ideals but no principles. I think it's certainly fair to say that Wilson was a reluctant warrior, but the speed with which he abandoned his public pacifism, which, by the way, Republicans of the time, as I said, were blaming for encouraging Germany's belligerence, doesn't really reflect well on him as a man of principle. When thousands of his pacifist supporters who had just voted for him on that ground came to Washington to protest, he banned all demonstrations and arrested and jailed those who persisted. And he told people in his war message to Congress that if they were disloyal, they would be met with the stern hand of firm repression, and he made good on that threat. In the end, of course, joining the Allied cause meant joining the winning side, and that might have benefited Wilson politically if victory in the war had come before the 1918 midterm elections instead of shortly after.
He's inaugurated for a second term on March 4th, 1917. War is declared April 6th, I believe, 1917.
Yeah, really as lickety-split as quickly as it could have been following his inauguration.
And you have, it's beyond dispute that the American involvement, the participation of the Americans on the side of the Allies made that victory possible. Germany's massive invasion, Operation Michael, in the spring of 1918, made possible after the Russians were out of the war. They never could have withstood it. And Wilson making the country safe for democracy, or however you want to put it, clearly was a turning point in American military and foreign policy history, as was Wilson's travels to Europe to be a part of the Versailles Conference to come up with a peace treaty. Why did Wilson decide to go, and what was the effect of an American president being in Europe for the first time? Something we take for granted now, obviously.
Yeah, it was totally unprecedented. No U.S. president had left the United States, had left American soil for more than a few days. And that was to inspect the Panama Canal when Congress was out of session. Leaving the United States as president when Congress is in session for any length of time has a direct impact on the legislative process, because in order for a bill to become law, of course, it's normally has to be signed by the president. In order to be signed by the president, the Constitution requires that it be presented to the president. And in Wilson's time, and really all the way to our own time, because the Office of Legal Counsel at the Department of Justice didn't get around to okaying electronic signatures and that sort of thing, or doing things in absentia when you're out of town until very recently. But in Wilson's day, presenting a bill meant enrolling it on parchment and hand delivering it to the White House. And if the president weren't there to receive it, then the 10-day period during which the president has the opportunity to veto it doesn't even start to run. When the president is not there, he can, in that way, become a great interference with the lawmaking process. And so this was all hotly debated when Wilson suggested himself for the peace conference. Congress was already hopping mad, even Democrats in the Senate, because the tradition had been, for example, to settle the Spanish-American War, that the peace conference would consist of senators from the majority party and the minority party, because that way they would have some idea of, and not just exclusively senators, but they would be represented on the Peace Commission, so that they would have some idea of what was happening and could represent it to their colleagues, knowing that a treaty cannot become effective under the U.S. Constitution unless it is ratified by a supermajority of the Senate. So when Wilson appointed himself, he also chose not to follow that tradition, and the Senate was not pleased about that. Leaving the country meant taking a long ocean voyage. It took a week to 10 days to get over there in the first place, and you could have rough seas, might take longer. And then once he got to Paris, this is on his first voyage, the conference didn't start for quite some time, so then he toured around in other countries, in England and Italy and so on. And meanwhile, America is a total mess. We had countries in recession, but that's the least of it. You've got serious race problems. It's really the eruption, the bubbling up of hostility from going on 8 years of Wilson's policies, which were really felt in Washington, D.C., but other cities too, in the South, in Texas and Chicago, all over the country. So we had race riots that went on coincident with Wilson's travels to and from Europe. He made 4 ocean crossings. He was gone for 6 months. In addition to the race problems, we, of course, had the Anthony Amendment, which we're trying to get across the finish line. The president was AWOL for that. And at the time, I believe it was the New York Times that published a survey of editorial opinion from newspapers. And so these were the editors of the newspapers across the country. And overwhelmingly, they thought the president shouldn't do this, shouldn't leave the country, shouldn't go. Initially, the leaders of France and England and Italy told him he shouldn't go. He was not a head of state, and heads of state would be attending. Or pardon me, he was a head of state. The U.S. president is both head of state and head of government, whereas their heads of government would be the negotiators, and the heads of state would be making formal appearances only and disappear. He wanted to be there because he felt nobody could interpret his mind. He put it in essentially those exact terms to Colonel Edward House, who was his trusted friend and ally and negotiator, not only in Paris, but also on domestic issues in the U.S. before that. House, by the way, was literally just a friend. He was never appointed to a government position and never confirmed by the Senate, was undoubtedly the most powerful advisor to a president, never to have an official role.
I love how you
So,
explain that in your book. That was no accident that he didn't he wasn't put up
yeah,
for
and he didn't want to
confirmation.
be. He didn't want to
Exactly.
be. He didn't want any accountability. So he had quite the remit.
You mentioned a few minutes ago about Woodrow Wilson's stroke in October of 1919 as he's traveling the country trying to get support for the League of Nations for the Treaty of Versailles. Um, we have 46 presidents at the moment, and we're doing this podcast on All Saints Day. So by the time it gets published, we'll know who the 47th president is. Would it be far-fetched to say that in reality, we are electing the 48th president because there was a president named Edith Wilson?
Entire books have been written about this subject. And it is fascinating to speculate about the first woman president or the Machiavellian first lady who secretly manipulates the federal government while her husband is incapacitated. The great movie, great novels, or the federal government being run by a female Rasputin who convinces her helpless invalid husband to agree to her plans for the country. I think Edith Wilson can be criticized for other things, which I can go into, but I would absolve her of being a power-hungry, illegitimate president operating in the shadows. And I think some people have strained to make that argument. I say this because that's not what she did. First and foremost, she was concerned about the president's health. And so what she did was keep work away from him. Her great sin was keeping the truth away from the American people. And of course, the reality of what had happened to Wilson was far worse than anyone in Washington could possibly know, let alone the rest of the country. Immediately after his major stroke in October 1919, anybody who just looked at Wilson could tell that something had gone terribly wrong. And so she allowed no one to see him. His left arm and his leg were paralyzed, and the left side of his face drooped. He suffered from acute digestive problems that indicated the stroke damage extended to his central nervous system. There was weakness in the muscles on the left side of his tongue and his jaw and his pharynx that made it difficult to swallow and interfered with his speech. He had an earlier stroke that degraded the vision in his right eye, and now the vision in his left eye was impaired. He suffered from occasional double vision at this time and frequent dizzy spells. He could no longer read. He couldn't sit in a chair to eat. He couldn't sign his name. All of his muscles were weak and his memory was faulty. The White House chief usher, Ike Hoover, wrote that he was mentally a pretender. Faced with all of this, Edith covered it all up. She went to extraordinary lengths to conceal the extent of the president's disability, and she had help. Wilson's personal physician, Cary Grayson, went along with this. So did the White House chief of staff, then known as the White House secretary, Joe Tumulty. For over 4 months, Wilson remained in this kind of total seclusion. Edith wasn't running the government at this time. The government was essentially running itself. Her significant function was to keep things away from the president. It's true that she made a few decisions for herself when, for whatever reason, she couldn't delegate it to someone in the cabinet. But for the most part, her objective was not to impose her will, but simply to protect her husband's health. I think that Ray Baker described very well what was the real situation. He recorded in his diary, remember he was the press secretary at Versailles, he recorded in his diary in late January 1920 that the president can't know what's going on. He sees almost nobody and hears almost no direct news. And he exclaims in his diary, was there ever such a situation in our history? And actually there had not been. Wilson gradually improved somewhat by the summer of 1920, but even then he was able to concentrate only for short periods, and he mostly watched movies every day. The few friends that Edith allowed to see him knew that they weren't supposed to discuss business. Ike Hoover brought Wilson to the cabinet room for some supposed cabinet meetings in his wheelchair, and Hoover said he'd just watch and pity as the president sat totally silent through these so-called meetings as if he were in a trance. So it was a really tragic ending to his presidency and his life. But no, I don't think Edith took advantage of this to usurp the presidency.
Do you believe that Wilson should have resigned?
Yes, of course. And whether in the early stages he even had the presence of mind to do that is a fair question. But at some point, because he was at some point improved enough to make some decisions, he got directly involved, for example, in instructing the Senate on how to vote on the League of Nations, and he instructed the Democratic senators to vote down any proposal that had any reservation, which killed the League of Nations when it would otherwise have had it killed the League of Nations for the U.S., would have had American participation. So he was making decisions directly, and he could have made easily the choice to turn things over to his vice president, and he chose not to.
Thomas Marshall, by the way, am I getting that correct? A terrific Hoosier.
Yes, a Hoosier legend who was the great promoter of the 5-cent cigar.
In 1948, historian Arthur Schlesinger ranked the presidents. At that time, he ranked Woodrow Wilson fourth, despite what you were just talking about for the last few minutes. 2024, the latest poll, American Political Science Association, Woodrow Wilson has dropped to 15th. Do you agree with this reassessment? Is this where you would put him?
Of course, these beauty contests for past presidents have all sorts of influences that make it not apples to apples to apples. A lot of kumquats and other fruits and vegetables in there.
But our fellow Republicans, Grant, he's gone way up. Eisenhower has gone way up. So you're right. I mean, it is, how much of it is apples to apples?
Yeah, and I think people, even historians, tend to vote for their favorites politically, even though presentism is something that all good historians fight against. Wilson was popular when what he was known for were the good aspects, or at least aspects that were thought to be good by progressives, of progressivism. And once it started to become not only clear to academics in the fine print of footnotes, but to the general public that Wilson was a profound racist, I think it no longer was tenable for him to be ranked as highly as he had been. He had been ranked especially highly, I think, from the outset because of the great momentum that was created by worldwide propaganda promoted by the Committee on Public Information, which was a wartime creation of his administration. 150,000 plus journalists and filmmakers and so on, whose job was to promote Woodrow Wilson, according to the chairman of this organization, George Creel, as the greatest man and the savior of the world. The propaganda was published in every form, the printed word, film, billboards, you name it, in Europe, in the Allied countries, as well as in the United States, so that when Wilson went to Europe and had all of these great parades filmed by the Committee on Public Information with Hollywood filmmakers, future Oscar winners doing the work, it was because of this saintly image of him that had been created as the champion of the world's democracy. And then we have a lot of biographies written by Wilson acolytes. And so there's this great head of steam that puts forward all of the good things about Woodrow Wilson, some of them inflated and exaggerated, but all positive. And then only later, starting in about the mid-1950s, do we have scholars who are taking a little more objective view. All of the people who served in the Wilson administration are now dead and gone. We have another generation looking at this without any emotional attachment. And they exhume some of the rest of these things. In my book, the focus being women's suffrage, we have another topic that was just entirely overlooked for the better part of a century.
15th seem about right? You would put him in the second 10?
This is a question I am totally unprepared for. I would have to sit down and go, because how do you compare him to presidents of the later 20th century, to presidents from the early days of the nation and so on? It just requires so much subjectivity. So I think Woodrow Wilson can be fairly judged, as I was saying earlier, according to the metrics of his own time established by his own peers and competitors, people who were alive then. I think that's fair. And I think that on the subject that I paid a great deal of attention to, the combination of his views on women's rights and on the civil rights of Black Americans, that he deserves nothing but low marks. If those were the parameters, he doesn't get to be 15th. Then ranking him in toto, requires evaluation of all the rest. And honestly, I'm going to leave that to other people who have perhaps more time available to themselves than I do to dig just as deeply into every single one of our presidents as I have Woodrow Wilson.
We've reached the point on the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. So these questions, no right answers, no wrong answers, but they've been answered by many of your friends, from Mitch Daniels and several others. So are you ready, sir?
I think I'm ready.
What was
Sounds daunting.
What was your first job?
Oh, my first job, working as a self-employed snowblower. Starting when I was about, I'd say 9 years old, 10 years old. I said snowblower, but I should have said snow shoveler, because the snowblower had not yet been invented. And I would grab my shovel on snowy days if I woke up on a weekend and looked out the window, and this is in St. Paul, Minnesota, and there were several feet of fresh snow. I saw dollar signs, and I would go out and spend all day, and I'd come home hot and sweaty, even though it was 10 below, and have a whole bunch of bills in my pocket. That was my first work.
Number 2, what was your first concert?
My first concert would have been in Minneapolis at the Guthrie Theater, I believe it was, and it was Joe Cocker.
Hey, that's not too bad.
Yeah, cool.
Number 3, if you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
Was this fiction, nonfiction, or
up to you, sir?
Here? Up to me. Any book. I'm going to suggest a book to read for fun. And it's a political book, but it's also a comedy written by Christopher Buckley. It's called Thank You for Smoking, later made into a movie. But I just think that it's hilarious. And I think a lot of people think it's funny, but they also think it's over the top. And I think it's close to a documentary about how Washington lobbying actually works.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Now, I am very sorry that I didn't know about this tradition of the 5 questions, because I would have looked them up in advance. But you're getting me cold on this. Any event in history, what a fun thing to be able to do. I suppose I would like to see something from a very long time ago. I would like to see one of the events in the Roman Colosseum. I'd like to get a great seat and see it in person, because it looks so cool in Gladiator.
Have you seen the sequel?
The new one? Haven't seen the new one, but I look forward to it.
I should note that Congressman Cox has a copy of the Principia behind him as he answers these questions on history. And the last one, and I get some grief because I don't give the questions out ahead of time, but it's the thought process that kind of makes it fun. Is, oh my gosh, would it be the surrender Appomattox? Would it be? Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose? And you've had dinner with presidents and who knows, all kinds of terrific men and women, but 2 hours off the record, anyone living today?
I would have said Paul Johnson, because it's a great disappointment in my life and career that I never even got to meet the man, even though so many people I know have. And I've read, I think, every one of his books. But
Brilliant.
he's no longer
Brilliant.
with us.
A brilliant
So,
historian.
yeah. So I'm going to go with, I'm trying to think of who would be my favorite mathematician or scientist that is still living, because it's so much fun to learn from those people.
Have you had dinner with Thomas Sowell?
I have not had dinner with Thomas Sowell. He would certainly be a fun person. So, gosh, I hate to strike out on a question now, because this should be about of equal difficulty as the historical event question. But there are so many people that I would like to rope up to sit them all around a table. And I'm trying not to pick somebody from politics, which is always the first thing that seems to be coming to mind now.
The most popular non-political, non-politician answer by far is Paul McCartney.
Paul McCartney. So they're going with music. All right. I'll tell you what I'm going to do, because he's still alive, and I've always enjoyed him when I see him on TV. He's still going strong. I'm going to pick a Georgian named Fran Tarkenton.
No, what? You're from Minneapolis. God, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
I should have suggested that.
Yeah.
Oh, my stars. Yeah, he's incredibly successful.
Yeah.
One of the most underrated football players of all time. My brother Michael, who was born in 1960, is still to this day a diehard, long-suffering Vikings fan. And so your answer makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and when you see him on TV, which is only occasional these days, he has always interesting things to say. I think that would be a great, fun 2-hour dinner.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmond Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today has been former congressman, current author of a fabulous book, Christopher Cox. We've discussed Woodrow Wilson, The Light Withdrawn. If you want to understand how we made the turn from late 19th century sort of Wild Bill Hickok America to international juggernaut, this is the book to read. Congressman Cox, thank you so much for your time coming on the podcast. As someone who's been a fan of yours since the 1980s, it's a real treat. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me just close by directing our listeners to www.lightwithdrawn. That's the subtitle of the book, and it's all one word, lightwithdrawn.com. This book has its own website, and on the website, you will have access to some 50 photographs from the 19th century and early 20th century that have been very carefully restored and historically researched for color and so on, and they look like they were taken with your iPhone. Really eye candy and all historically accurate. So fun things to look at, www.lightwithdrawn.com.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.